the ability to pass the test. Why is it necessary to understand the test? So in other words, I need to know, Carrie, that we're going to have a test tomorrow on English. These are the pages. Okay?
You know how to prepare.
Huh? I know how to prepare. God don't surprise you with nothing. Say, ha ha, test,
No.
He don't do that. He gives us time. I knew that Axton was different. I didn't understand it completely until I was telling Amber about this yesterday. We had a conversation. And it's really been laid on my heart about working more with my grandchildren and teaching my grandchildren responsibilities. And Axton has this singing voice, this falsetto singing voice that he uses, real high pitched, and it's this little singing voice. And I said, Axton, I said, do you understand the greatest threat to society right now? And he says, what? I said, it's where you take men and change the image of a male into the image of a female. There's a word, but basically when you neuterize a male, the masculinity, and you take that down because it's not good to be a masculine male. And I use the analogy of the differences between me and Mimi. I said, Mimi has been worried about all this time about getting Christmas ready because she wants you kids to have a good Christmas and she wants to be fair. She wants all these other things. And I said, I'm more concerned. And if y'all not noticed, we got the front of the church cleaned and all that's cleaned up now. So we're making efforts and we got all this picked up and cleaned up and we're getting all ready for all this stuff. And it's really been laid on my heart. I said, this is what a man does. A man is worried about, and we take care of this. This is our role. And I said, when you have society that tells that a kid I had this long story, Sabrina, picked out about how I was going to describe, and my favorite story, if a kid decides that when they're in, third grade that they want to become a pirate, that they can cut their leg off and poke their eyeball out, start wearing patches, start wearing, all right, matey. I said, that kid can't make the decision. Then I thought about the kid can't make a decision. I said, let the kid go into a liquor store down there and buy you a 6-pack of beer. I said, the kid can't do that. I'm thinking about all these stories about how I'm going to describe the action about why a kid can't make that decision about going through and transitioning. Right. But schools tell the kids they can make that decision, and this is this whole thing. Axton. I had said something to him. I said, yeah. I said, in kids, they tell kids. Axton says, kids are not prepared to make decisions like that. Kids can't even decide what they want to eat. They can't decide, this. They can't decide that. And if you know Axton, he offers this big explanation about why kids cannot do all these things and how kids cannot make that decision, how they're not capable of making these decisions. And I looked at him and I go, excellent answer. End of subject.
I wanted to be Spider-Man when I was 4. So.
Yeah. But the thing is that Axton already knew. What does that tell me? What burden does that put upon my shoulders to make sure that if I see this attribute in God, that this godly attribute in Axton, and how Axton's spiritual awakening has become and how these things are going, I need to make sure that not only am I nurturing that, I got to make sure that I am protecting that. That how and what he sees his papa doing is how does that help him? Does that hinder him? I see these things unfolding. So now I take this burden upon myself that I really need to even look better at myself, because again, if God is in this mixture, I need to make sure that I'm hooked up and in the mixture as well. Because if I am not, guess what I will be judged by? Exactly. So I go and I look at all these things and I look at this burden and this responsibility. This is my burden. This is my road. This is what's important in my life. And I find that now the things that I once considered important and set apart were nowhere near where I should have been and what were set apart. See, I'm fortunate that I've caught it now. Why? Because like I said earlier, this outpouring that's happening in the Spirit, this thing that's going on, the outpouring is very important. But more so important, we have to understand that our time is rapidly running out. And what is happening to society is an indicator of all these things coming unraveled and all these things. And our kids, as I've said before, have to be a priority. We have to make sure that we're nurturing our kids into not a society-based religion, but to a godly-based relationship. And that's where we have to lose our religion. We have to lose our religious things. That we have a religious thing on one side, but the other part says you have a form of godliness, but denying the power. And what that means is that you have these things, and we all have these things, but yet we're denying parts that God wants to consume the rest of us.
At this point, you're just trusting in a tradition rather than trusting in God. And
Exactly.
It's going to get you nowhere.
And not only that, Kai, but you're holding God back from having the rest.
Putting a box around God,
Yeah.
You're like, God can't do anything outside of this box.
Yeah, and the rest of our life, we don't want God to touch.
Right.
We don't want God to be in charge of our careers. We don't want God to be in charge of our lives. We don't want God to be in charge of our decisions. We don't put God, when denying the power means that we are not putting God in the place of total in our life. Does that make sense? And the thing is that when we start walking by these things that puts God first, what is important? What is necessary? What is our roles? What are we doing that is furthering the kingdom? And so now that we're trying to shift and change this whole point, Samson is a very good example of losing that religion and gaining God. It's sad that if you look at Samson's fall, there's only, if you read, I would challenge y'all to tell me within the entire story, I think I caught, and there might be 2, there might be 3 listed prayers that Samson made in the whole history of his life. What do you think about that? His prayers that he prayed unto God. And so you think about this, here's a judge, and it never really listed, it tells everything else that he did, but where does it put Samson's relationship with God at? Does that make sense? His prayers have been for vengeance. His prayer has been for this. And we start seeing these things and how they relate to us in our society. What is my wish? What would I hope for? I would hope again that, we could find and identify these things that are causing us to miss this point. In other words, what is causing us to be a little bit off target? What is causing us, it's like shooting an arrow. You think that you're shooting, but you don't see the unseen forces. A long-range sniper, he has to account for everything.
The wind speed.
Everything. The correlation of the earth. In other words, how the earth has a crown to it. We have to figure out all these things. Is the heat rising or is it falling? Because again, it depends upon where you're at. These are things that the further out we're looking, the longer and the more things we have to consider. But again, I would rather spend my time considering this and thinking of this than to be totally missing everything else of God. Why? Because I believe in the world it says, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all these other things will be added to it. I find that if I'll do the covenant, will focus upon doing my work that God has laid in front of me, that all these other things that I need to know, He gives me that knowledge. Does that make sense? He gives me that blessing. I didn't know how to do so many of the things that I have to do every day. But yet, God always finds a way to bless it. He always finds a way to make it work out. Why? Why does God always do that? Because it's not that I'm walking 100% because I'm not. But Kyle, what would happen if I was walking even closer? How much more so would I have an understanding?
And in that understanding, you would have to do something.
Yeah.
Couldn't just.
There you go.
I always wondered about that. I stopped thinking, because I was raised in church, and my daddy always broke the Bible down for me because I couldn't understand it and everything. But I tell you what, I just always imagined if I wouldn't have left my values at 30 years when I went in the military and left, I put God on the back burner and I lived in this world. I imagine what my blessing would be like now if I'd have stayed within my faith the way I was raised. What kind of blessing? I'm blessed now, but what would have been like more? He had more for me, but I betrayed him, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, completely.
I slid.
So there's this thing. So
What would you back regardless?
we're going to talk about that for a while. You know, but like I said, of all the things, there's so many things that I find just really interesting when we consider losing our religion and finding God.
Oh, another good. Well, I don't know if he ever really had a religion, but the prodigal son talks about the, that's what I always.
What was the story of the prodigal son? Think about it. Now, you got to understand the difference, Kai, between the story of the prodigal son and Samson. The prodigal son was a what? Parable. It was an illustration. So, but yet you're very right, because the thing is that the prodigal son had all the benefits and all the blessings, but he chose to do what?
Run away.
Samson, by existence, was a prodigal son. He was the son that was chosen from birth. And you see how he chose to walk away from where? Imagine, just like what Artie said, imagine if Samson would have listened to his parents and married him a good Jew woman.
Much different his life would have been.
But did you notice how he said it in the beginning of Judges? And he says, and he shall begin to deliver.
But see, it's awesome how he wasn't chosen. So God did that for a reason. Nazarites took it out. He put that on him, knowing that how the weight and significance of that would be, of doing something that you didn't choose yourself. You know, because it just illustrates that how we all fall away, but how God can bring us back through, and how we will be humble. You know, but how He's got to get you to that lowest spot, that dark spot, where Samson got, because he broke all three of them laws, and it got him down to nothing. He was blind. He just in a world of darkness, and then that's where he truly found God, and that's where he started really gaining that strength back. That's when his hair grew. That's when it really started coming.
That was his prayer.
But did you notice? I hadn't thought about it. I thought about it, but it didn't echo until you said this just then. This is again why I want you guys to be engaged. Why? Because you realize this is a thing for parents. You realize the promises and the things and the vows that you can make as a parent to instill in your child. What would happen if we as parents would believe and live and act as if our children were Nazarites and had that ability?
Right.
See what I'm saying about that? You catching that, right, AJ?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, I seen that when you said that a while ago. Y'all understand what I just said? Think about this thing.
The obligation that you would have, knowing that.
But just not the obligation. Consider it like this. You as a parent knows that God has a blessing for your kids that your kids can't see, but you can hold on to this even when your kids were off and doing whatever. Train up a child according to the way that they should go, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. These are blessings that as parents and as grandparents that we can claim. But did you notice who had to abstain from these things? His parents. His parents had to devote themselves and dedicate themselves to raising godly children. And even important enough that that Manoah prayed that God would send the angel back again so he could make sure that I've got this stuff down pat. What do you need me to do? I need to make sure I got all this. I can see Manoah sitting there with a notepad. Oh,